Now, I think most people know your founding story of, you know, starting by creating videos to tutor your cousin, I believe it was. But can you kind of share how things evolved from there?
Yeah, as you mentioned, this was back in 2004. My cousin Nadia needed help. I offered to tutor her remotely. One thing leads to another. She by me helping her a little bit, it went from her going from a remedial math class to an advanced one. So I started working with her family members. Word gets around my family that free tutoring is going on, and I soon find myself with 10, 15 cousins around the country for the most part. This is now 2006 at this point, and I started writing software for them. And so the software piece of Khan Academy, the practice piece, predates the videos. I always was fascinated by this idea of, hey, if students could get practice at their own time and pace, and I saw my cousins, a lot of them just had gaps in their knowledge. That was holding them back in algebra. It wasn't the algebra. It was their gap in exponents or their gap in decimals that was holding them back. So I wanted them to get practice, me as their tutor to see what they were working on and to understand where they were. And it was a friend that suggested in November of 2006, all my friends who had this crazy software project and tutoring project with my family. My day job, I was an analyst at a hedge fund. And my friend, his name's Zuli Ramzan, I have to give him full credit. He says, well, how are you scaling up your actual lessons? And I said, no, it's hard to do with 10, 15 cousins, what I was originally doing with just a handful. And he said, why don't you record some of them as videos and upload them onto YouTube for your family? And, I famously said, no, that's a horrible idea. YouTube's for cats playing piano, not serious math. But I went home that weekend, got over the idea that it was not my idea. And I did it, and it was just meant to supplement the practice platform. But it's the nature of YouTube. And I wasn't the first person to make math or science videos on YouTube. Frankly, I was probably the 50th person to do it in reasonably. But they just happened to be public. There's something about, I think, the way that it was kind of a family project. I don't know what it was, but it started to get a life of its own. And I kept working on the software piece as well. You fast forward to 2009, a ton of people were using it. At that point, it was around approaching 50,000 people a month. And I frankly had trouble focusing on my day job. And, I was getting letters from people all over the world saying, this is how I passed algebra. This is how my kids are able to keep up with their classroom. This is why I want to go back to college now. So it's pretty exciting. And I would get all these requests. And so 2009 is when I decided I incorporated as a nonprofit in 2008. But then 2009 was the year that I was like, I think, and me and my wife sat down. We said, okay, we had some money saved up for a down payment, but we're like, hey, maybe we could live off of this for a little bit. Surely someone will recognize the social return on investment. And I know you've been in a similar place, but you take that leap very optimistically, and then it usually takes a little while for for the rest of the world to appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. So you started, but in the beginning, it really was videos, right? Like that was the whole, after the software was the videos, right? That people were,
yeah, well,
but then it evolved into something, like tell us about kind of where it evolved to.
Yeah, it started as a practice platform, and then the videos were to complement it. I used YouTube as the video hosting platform. You can even today search by date uploaded. If you look at some of the early videos uploaded in November and December of 2006, I will start with like, welcome to level 3 equations. And, people are like, what are level 3 equations? That was a little module I had on the software. And so that was just helping students understand that concept. But then obviously the videos took a life of their own. In 2009 and 2010, when I was trying to get off the ground and make this into a real organization, the videos are what I think captured people's attention because they were just that much more accessible. People were just searching and finding them. They were resonating with a lot of folks in interesting ways. And so I would say because of the videos, we had our first significant funders, but when they said, what would you do with more resources? I said, look, the videos are nice, would keep making them, would translate them into the languages of the world, but I always imagined that the core of the platform would be really building out this practice platform. I didn't realize it at the time. I was just kind of intuiting my way into what this practice platform was. But, everything I was preaching was essentially mastery learning, and individualized paced mastery learning, which is not my idea. And arguably it's the oldest way of learning, but Benjamin Bloom, coined the term in the 80s. And he also showed with his famous 2 Sigma study that if a student gets a personalized tutor and is able to work at their own pace in a mastery learning framework, that the same student at the 50th percentile could operate at the 95th percentile. And so I had known about the 2 Sigma study in the back of my mind, but I didn't realize that I was intuiting my way to trying to implement essentially the same idea. Yeah. So when we got some of those first resources from the Gates Foundation and Google.org in 2010, that's when we said, hey, let's invest a ton on this practice platform, tools for teachers, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're working on tools for districts. But yeah, that's still the core and where most of our resources go.
Yeah. I was recently talking with a couple of people who are kind of venture capitalists, like significant venture capitalists in the ed tech space. And they were reflecting on their last decade in this. And they said that, they were at the beginning, had this vision of we're going to change learning outcomes. Like we're just going to put learning outcomes on a different trajectory through this. And they were saying, that it's been a disappointing journey, that lots of good stuff has happened and the ed tech space is thriving by comparison to what it was then, but that they've been disappointed, like we have yet to change the trajectory of learning outcomes. And I just wonder what your perspective is and what you feel like you've learned around how to best leverage technology to really ultimately change learning outcomes.
Yeah, I think in the early days, if we go back to 2010, 2011, and I would go out there preaching all this mastery learning stuff and not even knowing at the time that I was preaching mastery learning. I think everyone intellectually agreed with it. This is what ed schools have always taught, differentiated, everyone knew about Benjamin Bloom, et cetera, et cetera. I think the difficult thing was on the implementation side. I would say the vanguard of classrooms that were willing to go to a mastery learning model. In fact, they pretty consistently saw outsized gains, and in fact, fairly dramatic gains when students completed even 60 or 70% of their course in this type of a framework. There's a big Idaho study with 5,000 kids that saw the kids who, and there's some confounding variables around maybe motivation, whatever else, but the correlation was if they completed 60 or 70% of their course in this framework on Khan Academy, they grew 1.8 times the expected growth. So a pretty dramatic result. But the difficult thing was it's very hard for a traditional school, even a teacher who wants to in a traditional framework where they have grades and they have to cover a certain amount of material in a certain amount of time to move wholesale to a mastery learning model. I think where we have gotten since then is, we've started seeing that there's actually good efficacy even at an hour a week. And what we're really focused on right now, because there's several studies, there's actually a causal study in Brazil where they randomly assigned very similar classrooms, and then an hour a week they were able to do mastery learning on Khan Academy, and those classrooms saw 20 to 30% greater than expected growth. And then there's a bunch of correlative studies that essentially are saying the same data that we saw in the United States at Long Beach and Centennial School District outside of Philadelphia. And so now when we go to teachers in districts, say, hey, look, there's just a ton of teacher grassroots usage at all different levels. But now we're starting to go to districts and saying, hey, we think an hour a week is what it takes. And that way it doesn't completely upend and disrupt everything else you're doing. We can debate how much of the grade level kind of teacher directed, synchronous, traditional instruction or practice is suitable. I actually think some is reasonable. But if we're a little agnostic there and say, hey, somehow give us an hour, it feels doable. And we're starting to, I think, get more traction there. So there's about, in the US, there's about 1.5 million, there's 17 million kids, or actually not kids, learners who take some type of a learning action every month. There's 1.5 million of those who are, for the most part, US classroom learners. Some of them are international, but US classroom learners who are at that kind of dosage level that's associated with some of these efficacy gains. And our actually big focus now is how do we work with teachers, districts, schools to get that 1.5 million number to, frankly, every kid in America and then eventually every kid in the world.
Mm-hmm. And it's literally an hour a week. I'm actually sort of shocked by that, or at least that's, I assume, just how you're trying to get into the system. But even at that level of dosage, you see those effects.
Yeah, there's two surprising things, I guess, in a positive way. One is, you're right. Like I actually was surprised that an hour or why. It's actually, the studies are 30 minutes or more per week. So it averages about 58 minutes or something like, or 48 minutes. But when you actually look at, if you actually, and we haven't done this in a systematic way, but I think, someone could quite easily. If you just try to quantify in a traditional system, let's say in a week, in a math class, say a 7th grade math class, how many problems a student is able to do and get feedback on, it's actually not a lot. It's in the maybe, if a precocious student who actually frankly already knows the material, they're fine. But the average student, they go home, they're doing the problems, they're not getting immediate feedback, they're doing most of them incorrectly. It's really in the low tens, probably 20 or 30 that they're probably doing in a week. But even in that hour, they're getting an equivalent amount, but it's more, it's adapted to what they need. So it's not just random stuff, and they're getting immediate feedback so they can constantly improve themselves. Imagine if in a traditional system, imagine if you were trying to improve your free throw and you're at the free throw line and you take a bunch of free throws and you don't know how you did until the next morning on those free throws. That's essentially what we're talking about. And you really don't know your free throw percentage until 2 weeks later when you take a free throw test. It's very hard to get good at something if you're not getting immediate feedback that helps you correct yourself. So that's the one thing that's, on one level it's surprising, on the other it's not, because even in that hour they're doing frankly more practice than they would do the rest of the week, and they're doing it in their zone of proximal development. The other thing that is at first surprising is almost, every time we change, and we're constantly changing the experience, like, hey, we need to do more of this or that, we're getting feedback, and we're always like, oh, but we're afraid to mess it up because we had these efficacy claims from the old system. What about the new one? Almost every permutation of mastery learning is giving pretty consistent results. And I think that goes back to the same thing. On the margin, we can try to tweak it so it engages students more. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do. But as long as they're getting a good number of problems with feedback at their zone of proximal development, they're seeing it in different contexts. They can do focused skill practice, but then they can do context switching practice. Then they can do unit level and course level practice. As long as those things are attained, it on one level, it makes sense that it's helping them.
Yeah. And what's the challenge to spreading this as quickly as possible across the U.S. and across the world? Like, what are the biggest barriers, or what are the things you're tackling to get there?
Our current, I tell people at Khan Academy that, we're entering phase 3 of our organization. Phase 1 was the Sal in a walk-in closet phase. And, that was kind of like, this was a hobby kind of proving itself that it's worth people to take seriously. Phase 2 started around 2010 when serious people, thoughtful people said, hey, this looks legit. We're going to put some real money behind this for it to become a real organization. And, the last, let's call it 7-8 years was phase 2, where we show that this can work, this can scale, it can be valuable for a lot of folks. And even though we're at frankly, a larger scale than I would have imagined at this point in time, especially if you were to ask me back in 2008, where, would you ever be reaching a large chunk of, I think that our marketing team did a survey, I think 60 or 70% of American kids use this once a year. And in certain geographies like Brazil and India, things are hopefully, we're starting to pick up there as well, but and Mexico as well. For us, the challenge is how do we get to that 57 million, getting to that dosage? And the current view is if we can we're starting to talk to districts. We've always had partner districts that we just say, hey, you want to partner with us? They're like, yeah. And we would show up there, do some training, and they would make some announcements to teachers like, we're partnered with Khan Academy. There'd be a little bit of PR. And those would be good. In fact, Long Beach in California and Orange County, Florida, and there's actually a few in Brazil that have actually done that quite well. But but it still is not reaching every child. And what we hear from mainstream, especially large urban districts and actually rural areas, but especially the urban districts, is they want more teacher training. They want more. It's all the classic stuff. It's essentially the stuff that an enterprise software company would have to do: the training, the integration with their existing systems, district level dashboards, and all of that. And we were shying away from that for a bunch of years because it just felt like a lot of on the ground work, for lack of a better word. If you imagine Khan Academy is kind of an Air Force, we're able to reach a lot of things very quickly. This type of work is a little bit more of an army type work where you're going, door to door. But we now realize if we really want to get to every kid in America, we need to do that. And so we are looking at models where districts put up some resources. We obviously are putting a lot of resources into this so that it can sustain itself, but we can do that more high touch with districts. So, literally in the last couple of months, there's some large urban districts. We haven't announced them yet, but you can imagine what they're like that are going to be doing this. And we hope that it'll get us further. There are some big headwinds. The classic, Khan Academy has never been I've never grouped it in the category of like paid ed tech, because we've always been free. And even this thing is around, how do we co-resources to make this go well? But, traditional tools in ed tech that get paid for, 60% of the time don't go opened. It just gets no one. Frankly, I think even in districts where we aren't partnering with, we already have a better rate because so many people use this in lighter ways. And in fact, I would say most students who know about us use this in some way, shape, or form. But it'll be an interesting challenge. But I'm pretty bullish about it because the hour a week seems reasonable. We're hearing good things from the district's teachers.
You also started a couple years ago, and I actually don't know. It's still going on, right? The Khan Academy Lab School.
Yes.
Can you share a bit about what the big idea there was and what you're learning?
Yeah, so the big idea there was, in the early days, y'all heard, I was preaching, hey, in a world where students get information delivered at their own time and pace, if they can get practice at their own time and pace, then it liberates the physical classroom to be much more about Socratic dialogue and simulations and peer-to-peer help. It allows us to break open these paradigms of, one teacher, 30 students, teacher speaks, kids write. It could, in theory, allow us to break the paradigm of, one pace for all the kids, the paradigm of grouping kids by ability level or even age and ability level, and maybe unlock the power of peer-to-peer learning. In theory, you should rethink the transcript and grades. It should be mastery learning. So you should be the transcript of the future should be the competencies, the academic competencies and skills that you have. It could be your portfolio of creative works you've created, and it could be some type of subjective evaluation from your peers and faculty on your other capabilities, collaboration, creativity, whatever it might be. And I wrote about it in my book, One World Schoolhouse. And so it's one thing to theoretically write about it. It's another thing that was another one of those things. Everyone read it, or whenever I gave a speech about it, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But, you kind of look around and the world does not look like that. And so I was intrigued by like, hey, the way I'm going to really learn, and this goes back to, the way I really learned about how to reach my cousins was by working with them. So the only way if I'm going to be preaching to all of these folks about how schools should be architected, we should try to start one that could also be a bit of a laboratory for us to see what's working or not. And while we were doing it, we frankly started questioning other things that could have been questioned well before Khan Academy, like why aren't we full day, full year, et cetera, et cetera. So that school started almost 5 years ago now. We're finishing up the fifth year of the school. I got to tell you, so the good news is a lot of those things I think have been validated. Not all of them. I think frankly, the most powerful thing that I did not fully appreciate is the mixed age aspect of it. It really does feel like a school where it's a family, where a lot of times if they're, I've picked up my two older kids go to the school and my youngest is going to go next year, but I've picked up my daughter several times, when she was 6 or 7, she's 7 now, where a 14-year-old is just reading to her for kicks and their friends. And you don't see that in a lot of schools. I've seen, the 16-year-olds really do end up being mentors or tutors. My son, his hero, and frankly, the best math teacher for my son was a 15-year-old. They connected and they had a rapport, and it was good on both sides. So there's a lot of great help there. I think the school doesn't have traditional letter grades. It's mastery learning. It's full year, full day. I would say that the biggest challenge, and look, starting school's a wild ride. I'm sure many, y'all have all done variations of things like this. It's the things that I have a appreciation for. And I'm not the head of the school. I'm the chairman, but I'm actively involved, and the school is downstairs, so I walk through it every day. One, you realize, at the end of the day, schools are a service business, so it's very different than a software-based thing where every day, things can't slip, and you have this, you have the students, you have the faculty and the administration, you have the parents, so you have this really interesting stakeholder problem. That even when you're doing some major course corrections, you have to, you kind of have to put a pretty strong face on, otherwise people get pretty spooked because their most precious thing, they're kids, and then you have all these things. And I think the other really major challenge is, I think, a school like this attracts some really, I would say it attracts some of the best teachers and progressive educators in the world, but I would say one of the things we're trying to resolve is even some of the most progressive educators are still not used to working in an environment where that's a non-adult centered environment, I would say. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that, I'm working with the admin and the faculty to really challenge of like, hey, why can't we give the students more space here? Why can't we let them lead more? Why can't the 17-year-olds lead this? And really trying to get the faculty to appreciate that it's not the performance that you as the adult put on. It is you as the architect and the puppet master. But what do the students do on their own when you're not there? And that's actually a hard thing I find for a lot of adults, especially when their whole life they were evaluated on kind of the performance they are putting on in class. And I would love nothing more than seeing the adults kind of in a corner reading a magazine. Like, I think that would be the sign. Yeah. And if the kids are or self-organizing and doing incredible things every now and then they're saying, hey, adult, can you put your magazine down? I have a question. And if the adult's like, oh, all right, that'd be great. I'd love to see more of that. And so I'm definitely pushing them on that front. I do a little bit of teaching in the school every now and then. And that's, I do fun Socratic stuff. But a lot of times I try to say, okay, what are objectives, young people? And and I'm like, okay, I'm here to help, but y'all figure it out.
Yeah. It's very similar to what we've learned. The unlearning that we need all of us adults to do to actually teach in a student-centered way is just huge and such a process. I have two more questions, you all, but be ready with your own questions, and you can start putting them in the chat, and I'll call you out to surface them. So, Sal, one, as you know, we're, placing teachers initially with the idea that they then become leaders and the innovators we need. Like, we'd like them to be pioneering the future in terms of educational technology alongside other things, but we're placing them initially, like their kind of typically foundational experience in education is working in traditional public schools in the most under-resourced areas. Some of them in high bandwidth places, but some of them in extremely low bandwidth places. And I think, and so typically they aren't really usually, there are exceptions to this, but leveraging technology that much in their actual teaching practice. And I think we have puzzled for a long time, and actually are trying to get more serious about actually figuring out, like, what should we actually do? Like, if we want these people to be leaders in leveraging technology to get, where we all want to be beyond their 2 years, then what do we need to be doing with them? What would you do if you were us to increase their level of engagement, I guess, with the possibilities of technology?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity because the exact, the young people that y'all are bringing into the teaching profession are super energetic, super bright. Frankly, I would guess most of them have already, if we're talking about right now, they've been the beneficiaries of technology. I would guess a large chunk of them used, stuff we've made and MOOCs and other stuff. And so, the more that we could collectively leverage them to almost be the they're the ones bringing the, even if it's an hour a week of mastery learning into the classroom. I think that would be pretty incredible. That would, and they can be that change into and Wendy and I've talked a lot about this. At some point we should figure out some way for us to do this together. But I think that's, and I know, especially if you're looking globally, I do have to say I've been pleasantly surprised by, over the last 8 or 9 years, when all of this kind of started in the United States. A lot of districts and teachers were like, oh, technology, bandwidth, computers, it's not going to work. Now in the United States, I'm just not hearing that much. People have got the technology, they've got the bandwidth. Depending where you are in the world, it's a different picture. Some places it's ahead of the US, some places it's behind. But it seems like the trends are really good. In places like India, I know that the cell phone connectivity has dramatically gotten cheaper, which opens up, it seems, all sorts of new avenues. I really would love to explore ways that these young, super capable, high energy teachers are on the vanguard of bringing some of this kind of technology enabled models. And that's the thing I always point out, and I know you agree with this, when it's not the technology for technology's sake. There's some ideals that there's always been in education, which is differentiation and mastery, which has just never been practical without technology. And so with those as the objective, so I would say, how do we empower these young teachers to bring that differentiation and that mastery into the classroom? And the best way I know of doing it is leveraging some technological tools.
Yeah, that's helpful. If any of you all out there across the network have ideas about how we should be working together, please do reach out and let us know, because we're giving lots of thought to it and would love ideas. One more question, Sal. So you just finished, I think, your official 10-year mark. I read your letter of reflecting on the first decade in your journey as a social entrepreneur. And I wonder if you can share, many of these folks, all of them are on these entrepreneurial teams too, and somewhere in years 0 to 10 typically of the journey. And I wonder if you can share one of your most salient learnings personally, on that journey.
There's a lot, and and I'm still, sorting through a lot of things in my, but some of the things that I always remind myself is, don't lose your impatience, but be patient with it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I have a lot of impatience around, when are we going to be able to do a global credential? When are we going to be able to get credit for kids, who do stuff on Khan Academy? When are we going to be able to do, we're hoping to launch, I'm getting feedback or something. When are we able to do, I could go down the list. There's 20 things that I wish we could do tomorrow. But then when I appreciate the stuff that's happening now and the stuff that we have to now start to do methodically, if we really want to make a lasting impact, then that's kind of where the patience kicks in. So I think that's one. I think there's another thing that I think any type of an entrepreneur, every day is an adventure, and there are going to be days that you feel like you're on top of the world, and then there are other days where it feels like everything is falling apart and you can't fall asleep and you're just worked up. And what I've gotten a little bit better at is just reminding myself that, every time I'm in one of those bad days where I'm just like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And why aren't they doing this? And this needs to happen. And why didn't that happen yesterday? I just remind myself that 2 weeks later, I forget about it. Cause it usually resolves itself. And when we have another piece of really great news. And so, my lows are not as low as they used to be, because I have that. I've gone through enough of them now to know that there's a pattern, and as bad as they seem, and this is just life advice in general. Things always get better, as they say. So, I think those are but I would say the other one is also just never lose sight on the big vision. I think that's almost like my main job here at Khan Academy. We have a really great president and chief operating officer who's far more capable than I am at managing. We're now 200 plus people, she used to she could be a CEO of, frankly, any tech company in Silicon Valley, but she's at her stage of life where this is what she wants to do. So we work together a lot, but my job is, as the team is executing, that we don't forget that, yes, we do one day want to do a global credential. We do have aspirations of reaching billions of people around the world. We do, we're not okay just reaching, only a few million. We want to reach every child on the planet. And those are the types, and we're building an institution that we're not just, we shouldn't just start to act like an ed tech company, that we're trying to build an institution. Think more like the Smithsonian, or think more like the great universities of the world thought. How do we become an institution for the planet for generations? So that's the kind of stuff that I try to keep the team reminding them about.
Awesome. That's super helpful. I'm going to remember, be impatiently patient.
Patiently impatient. I don't know. Makes no sense.
Okay, we have lots of questions here and various comments about Khan Academy in Armenian language and Bulgarian language, etc. But let me ask, Tony, do you want to get us started by asking your question? And you all introduce yourselves as well.
Sure. So hi, I'm Tony. I actually met you, Sal, like 5 years ago at a really random conference called the Desire to Learn Conference. You were the keynote speaker. And I have a question just about international expansion. I'm like very curious as to how you guys think through mobile first, especially as you expand internationally into places where people are used to using their mobile phones before anything else.
Great question, and something, frankly, we've been struggling with. It's interesting because our first foray into mobile was in that 2010, 2011 period where, everyone needed a mobile strategy, apps, everything, the whole world. But that, frankly, even though our mission has always been a global one, back in 2010 and 2011, we had a very North American centric worldview. And one thing, and we have a mobile app out there, but one thing that we appreciate, that we learned over time is that the use cases in which Khan Academy is used most deeply, mobile is okay, but most people actually will still prefer desktop. You can imagine the student who's trying to study, they try to, we all used to do this. I'm going to study now. They get your textbook out, you get your pencil out, I'm going to study. And so now they bring their laptop out. They just have more space to work with. Obviously the classrooms, I think things like Chromebooks are definitely in the US winning out versus tablets and for sure mobile. But when we think about international, especially India, so, the geographies where we have we have 30 something languages where there's some type of translation efforts, but the geographies where we have literally, on our payroll team members, and we have deep partnerships, are Brazil, Spanish-speaking Latin America, India, and India especially, more than is, that's where it's a mobile first world, and we're struggling with it. I mean, I think this is one of those puzzles actually, whether we were not for profit or for profit, as a relatively small organization. To what degree, our India team's been dying for us to, just become a mobile first, especially, and it's mobile first in an Indian context type of mobile first, which is different than even what a mobile first would be in the United States. App size and all that stuff matters a lot. So we've been trying to make incremental improvements on that size, make the app smaller, cache more stuff, make it less dependent on bandwidth, things like that. So we're making progress, but I can't say this goes to the impatiently patient part. This is something that we with all of what we're trying to do is not happening as fast as any of us would like.
Great, thanks. Vidya, do you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, Vidya. I lead the internal technology team. So
I can barely hear you.
Okay.
Barely hear you.
Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I lead the internal technology team. I've got a tech-related question. Are you using any of the new technologies? I'm not sure if you're already using. I know you've got a lot of content translated in different languages. Are you planning on using any of the technologies like machine learning or natural processing to
So if
provide,
I heard is, so you're saying, are we using new technology? Which new technologies are you talking about?
like machine learning or natural
Oh, yes, yeah. So it's interesting. I'd say about 6, 7 years ago, we had this big project because we part of our mastery learning thing. It had recommendations, and we're like, hey, we should use machine learning. Test. We have all this data and test what the recommendations should be. That was my first foray into doing it in this context. I got to say, we had mixed results. I think a machine learning is so dependent on where on the data set on which you test it, and then it will do some bizarre things that are counterintuitive, and it's hard to say is it some genius machine learning that's just counterintuitive, or is it just doing something silly? And so we actually did appreciate that for what we were trying to do back then. It was actually probably a better experience to do it a little bit more kind of heuristic, a little bit more kind of curated, give the student agency, and now we're actually going back to looking at machine learning. And the way I want to do it is to have our cake and eat it too, where the students and teachers know the context and they can chart their own path, and that there's a curation that is well thought through by educators of scaffolded. But then there's an overlay on top of that, which is kind of a machine learning algorithm that says, hey, this activity for this long is going to be your highest gradient activity next. We still do that on our SAT practice, still does that. And I'm hoping to reintroduce that into some of our other mastery learning that we're doing. But that would be the other new technologies. Virtual reality, we haven't still gives me headaches. But we're always on the lookout. And what I always tell folks is, we are a company. We aren't a technology company. We're an organization trying to have social impact, leveraging technology. So, I think some folks get enamored with technology for the sake of it, and then it's a solution in search of a problem. where we try to go, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And if the solution is chalk, if the solution is making it simpler, if the solution is paper, we'll use paper. But yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Alejandra, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, she says, my mic doesn't work. Sorry. You could type it.
Okay, her question was how Khan Academy works or proves the increase in the personal development of the students that use your method.
So I think what you're alluding to is, earlier we were chatting about these efficacy studies, and that's talking about essentially test scores. But I think what you're alluding to is, are there other metacognitive things that are happening? Simple answer is we haven't. It's hard to quantify it. I'm pretty sure it is happening. And going back to the lab school conversation, it is amazing the difference you see in kids who have been in control of their learning for many years versus kids who might transfer in around, say, middle school and are kind of like, all right, teacher, what should I do next? And it's a completely different mindset. And it's, when we have kids transferring in from other schools, even if they are great students and all this is the thing that we are most sensitive to, that we would rather have, and the lab school actually does not have any type of testing or standardized tests or grades as a threshold to get in. So it's unlike most schools like that. Anyone can get in as long as when they come on their shadow day, they're not disruptive to this kind of student-centered framework, and they're not checked out, and they feel like they can really engage in it. So I think that students who are able to kind of drive their own learning are fundamentally far more empowered. And I'd argue that that's more important, especially where we're going with the world, than the actual academic skills themselves. It's nice to be able to factor a polynomial, but it's even more powerful to know that if I ever forget how, if I need to learn the next new thing, I know how to do it. I have that capability because, we all know it's already the case. But there's already you can almost learn anything through the internet already. You just have to have the motivation and the will. And as we go into the future, that's going to become an imperative that you're going to have to do that probably regularly.
Yeah. Awesome. Jeff, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks, Wendy. Hi, Sal. Nice to meet you. I'm the director of video multimedia here at Teach for All. Very nice to meet you. We're doing a lot of internal videos for sharing and learning across the Teach for All network. And as we start to scale this, I'm wondering if you have any advice in terms of, less so on content, but more terms in terms of technologies and structures as we amass a lot of video learning materials. Like how should we be thinking about this as we go to increase usage and scale and searchability and discoverability of these assets?
Yeah, and are these things that y'all keep private, or is this stuff that you're fine sharing?
A mix of both. We do a lot of public-facing videos, but there's a lot of internal stuff that might have permissions for both internal and external. So it really depends, but I would say both.
Yeah, and take what I'm going to say with a grain of salt, because frankly, I've been pushing our team. Y'all sound like you might be ahead of us. And so it's like, hey, why aren't we doing that for our own internal training and internal, so take us with a grain of salt. You probably know better than I do the various platforms that are available. I mean, what's it, Vimeo or YouTube, or you have some internal. I know YouTube's about to launch kind of a more structured. They've always had playlists, but they're going to allow kind of these units and kind of a more of a course structure. So that might be helpful. But yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert. We're obviously kind of custom. We host on YouTube and then also on Amazon Web Services where YouTube is blocked. And then we're kind of custom creating our own platform to curate all this stuff in the practice. And sometimes, and we leverage our own platform for our internal stuff as well. But yeah, you know better. And I know you said not about the content, but one thing I do always encourage people is, the more natural and informal it is, and the more pure it is coming out of people's minds, the better.
Great, thank you.
We have a couple questions about parent and community involvement, but Kaya, do you want to articulate your question?
Yep. Hi, Sal. Kaya Henderson here. I wanted to know if there are any examples, especially around the world. We tend to be sort of North American or at least Western centric as well. Would love to hear of any examples where you see Khan increasing the involvement of families and communities in new ways into the student academic experience?
I wish I could say we had some data or some studies around that. We don't. We get a lot of anecdotal letters.
Yeah, that's exciting.
From parents. I do this with my young. We just launched Khan Academy Kids, which is our early learning app. So it's in theory usable as young as 2 years old, and it covers all the Head Start standards, and it goes through the kindergarten Common Core standards. There the best use case is a child doing it in the lap of a loved one, doing it together, talking about it, is the ideal. And frankly, even the kind of the proper Khan Academy that starts to, early, mid-elementary stuff, I still think that's really valuable, with my own kids, especially when they're young, to be able to sit next to them and kind of not answer their questions. I want my kids to answer the questions, but for me to kind of give them a nudge, a little bit of a push, some motivation, unblock them a little bit, makes a huge difference. And it's actually incredibly fun bonding, because you're bonding around something pretty substantive. But we haven't done anything formal. And this goes into one of those prioritization things. We've definitely had ideas of like, hey, how could we go really deep in parent engagement? We could create parent tools. We could do that, but it's just, bandwidth.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, you all. I'm going to try to get to as many of these as we can. Deb, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Wendy. Hi, Sal. I'm Deb. I lead on our content and marketing and editorial at Teach for All. I'm curious. My question was, how does the school support kids who are less self-driven and self-advocates by nature? And I ask this as the parent of 2 kids who've gone to pretty student-centered schools their whole lives, not quite to the degree it sounds like Khan Academy is. And they're both very different kids. And some kids are just, I get that in the world that it's a huge asset, right? If you are self-driven in that way, but not every kid is like that. And I'm wondering, does the school support that, or, yeah. That's basically it.
Yeah, and I don't want to pretend like we have all, it's still a relatively small school. It's 165 kids now. And the kids most of those kids showed up, 5 years ago when they were pretty young. someplace between 5 and 10 years old. And, we were just like, the school was a PowerPoint presentation. So we were happy anyone who was willing to send their kids to it. So it was kind of a random mix of kids. I wouldn't say it maybe where we are and, brand associations of Khan Academy, I'm sure there was definitely some self-selection going on, but, I'm pretty, we haven't seen children, especially coming in when they're kindergarten or first grade, who are like not, who aren't into it. I think at the very young ages, you might have some self-regulation issues where, they just, but it's never been that they didn't enjoy being kind of in control of their learning a little bit more and in control of the, and in fact, we've had a couple of kids. I mean, you learn this when you start a alternative school, that it tends to attract kids and families at both ends of the spectrum. And we did have kids at the end of the spectrum that was more, they were struggling at other schools. They didn't fit in. They were getting bullied. We didn't even know that until they show up. And, the teacher's like, well, it looks like there's something going on here. But we have seen that those kids also, it might just be, it's a small school too. It feels like a family. We've seen, and there's no studies here, so, but it's been promising. So I don't want to make it sound like a panacea, but we've seen consistently most kids, if they have significant needs, this school actually can't support it. It's a small school. It can't, but we've seen most kids do pretty well. It's the older kids that we see a lot of that. And it actually doesn't even correlate with their grades or their scores or any of that. We see kids who come in 9th grade and they were straight A students, but they're just kind of struggling taking control of their own learning, and they're used to a mindset of like, what can I get away with? And obviously you can get away with a lot for some period of time in a school without grades where you're in control of it. But we're still, we're still figuring it out.
Jeff Kern, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. My name is Jeff. I work with Teach for All here in Israel. Huge fan. It's interesting to see you after so many hours of just hearing your voice on various courses. Like Wendy, I have a son who was studying for the equivalent of the SATs here in Israel. And it was very interesting because he stopped going to school. And his argument was that he said, look, I have great teachers in school, maybe the top 30%, 20, 10% in the world, but I can go online with a click of a mouse and I could be exposed to the top 1%, right, of teachers in school. And he did fine just doing that. I'm wondering what you think about a world that's really trending in this direction, where you're not going to have the challenge of introducing this, but it's almost going to be the reverse, right? Kids will be choosing to do this and this only. And what does that mean about, our traditional physical schools and their contribution to children's education?
Yeah, I was just at a major university and I was speaking to their board of trustees. I think at the younger age levels, you absolutely need the physical space and the community and all of that. But I think once you get to late high school, and for some kids even early high school, but for most kids late high school and college and beyond, I think all bets are off. I think a lot of people are going to be like your son, and they're going to be off to the races. Now, I think he still would benefit from maybe being able to do that in the community, having some mentors, et cetera, et cetera. But I think already med schools are infamous now that they record their lectures and that no one shows up at lectures. If you go to almost any med school, I don't know in the rest of the world, but in the United States, no one goes to the lectures. They're all at home watching the recordings of the lectures on double speed, or recording of another med school's lectures on double speed. And that's starting to happen in undergraduate as well, now that the lectures all exist. So it's already happening. And what I told this board of trustees of this major U.S. university, I was like, look, I don't think you're going to go away, especially this one is a very selective one. They have, they accept 10% of the kids who apply. But you've got to really rethink this 300-person lecture hall. This is silly in this day and age. You have all these people coming together. Especially in the U.S., they handcraft these communities. We need a tuba player. We need someone who can dance. We need some Republicans. We need some liberals. We need. They create these but then they create, but then everyone just falls into their silos, and you go to a classroom and you're just staring at the teacher, and you don't even get to meet the people in the next aisle. So I pushed them. I was like, look, the people are going to get their core skills at their own time and pace. Make the 4 years of college all kind of a big project lab, and then students can opt into whatever seminars are going to be valuable for them to meet whatever they're trying to build in their portfolio. And when they go to those seminars, they should be interactive. They should be working with their peers in that room to work on things. And especially, it's shocking, especially some of the more selective universities, I'd say around the world, the kids that they accept are equivalent to grad students. It sounds like your son could already be a grad student, but they're treated like children and kind of been force-fed things at a very fixed pace. So that's my 2 cents. I think the schools that transition to making the physical very interactive and worthwhile are going to do fine.
Okay, we're going to try to squeeze in. I don't know if we'll make it 2 more questions. Ekta, do you want to surface your question? Ekta from Teach for India. She has a long question on the chat, the last one on the chat, Sal, if you want to read it.
Okay, will I click on chat?
Oh, I can read it to
Oh, okay.
you.
I see. Let's see. The last one on the chat. Okay. I'm Edgar. I work with Teach for India. My questions. 1, subjects like maths has a lot of indigenous ways of knowledge systems associated with it. Do you think it's possible to combine these in math teaching at Khan Academy? This is also to bring the focus different communities across the world. So I think what you're saying is that there might be a lot of approaches to teaching the math that's unique to a geography. We do have, in fact, I have on my email, I have a weekly video request, and I actually do have 10 video requests from the India math team. It's on India-specific standards that we've not covered in the US. So we're definitely, over time, trying to teach those standards. And part of those standards, I think, do go into some of the different approaches that someone might do. So we are doing that. And then there's a second part. We work with a community of teachers in India who love Khan Academy videos and get them to interact with educators across the world, thinking of education differently. Would you be interested in doing a webinar with us? Maybe.
Awesome. Okay, I'm so sorry I didn't get to everyone, but Rebecca, Rebecca Rich, let's let you have the last question.
Hi, Sal, thanks. I'm Rebecca Rich. I'm the Chief of Staff at Teach for All. I'm curious, in light of the ambitious goals for Sal Academy, how do you make this work personally sustainable?
Oh, yes. It's Khan Academy. I'm already sensitive about it being my... I will say, I used to make fun of people who name things after themselves. I'm like, what a narcissist. But I do have to say, and Wendy gets a lot of credit because she did not do this in either of the major efforts she started. This isn't, but one of the things that I struggled with when starting a non-for-profit is, unlike a for-profit where your ownership dictates control, a nonprofit, there is no ownership. But there was a little bit of a ego side of me that says, hey, I'm starting this. I want to make it very hard for them to fire me. And so that's where, I'm not kidding. I mean, that was the very methodical thought process I went through to say, I'm going to stick my name on this thing. And then there was a second thing that I thought I was thinking in terms of an institution. And I thought, if you call this like Math Planet or Math, blah, 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 it would just sound like an ed tech company. While if you really think about the institutions of the world, they're usually named after a place or a person. And it just sounded more like, hey, Khan Academy, that could be a thing. That could be a place where you get a degree from versus, if one day if we have a global credential, the Khan Academy Global, it sounds better than, the Mathpedia Global, that sounds cheesy. So anyway, but to answer your question before I got defensive about why it's not Sal or Khan Academy, look, I think this is something everyone works on. I'm someone, I got to say my previous boss, I give him a lot of credit on a lot of things. This is my first boss out of business school. I was working at a hedge fund. Most people who work in finance are working like dogs. They have no balance in their life. And I was kind of prepared to do that. And I remember early on, he's like, hey, Sal, why aren't you going home after the market's closed? I was like, no, Dan, I got 5 companies I want to make models for and blah, 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 blah. He's like, no, look, our job as investors is not to make many mediocre decisions. Our job is to make a few good ones and avoid bad ones. And the best way that you can do that is go home, recharge, have a perspective, read books on other things. That'll make you a more creative thinker. And then just come in that 9 hours, 8 hours that we're in the office, that you got your game on. And that's what we did. And it was very intense when we were there for 8 or 9 hours. But then I was able to go home and read books, tutor cousins. Frankly, I would not have been able to tutor cousins. I would not have been able to work on Khan Academy if he did not have that mindset. So I've always kind of had this, and frankly, I've always been someone who's always working on some skunk work on the side. I can, so for me, it's always been important to, I'm fairly intense when I'm doing something. I can be, sometimes if people walk in my office, I try to be personable, but I have to like tell myself to. They just walk in, I'm recording a video. So I can be pretty intense when I'm in the zone, but like at 6 o'clock, I'm pretty disciplined about, I'm done. I go home. I got young kids. They grow faster than you expect. I hide my phone. I don't touch. Unless there's an emergency, I don't check my email, anything. Weekends are for my family and for me. And actually, I'm now trying to get even more. I'm trying to get even better about taking even longer breaks because you realize it does change you in a good way, and it makes you recharge. Because without noticing, you can very easily burn yourself silly. I've had pockets of real stress, where weird things started happening. I started getting claustrophobic for no reason. I started having like anxiety for no reason. And that stuff creeps up on you if you're not really, really, really careful.
Such good advice. Thank you so much, Sal, for spending the last hour with us.